Hey folks, welcome to another episode of The Hole on the Corner. I'm Dan Peterson, aka Dr. Rockter. And in this episode, I just got to jump on here and talk about Bookpilled, the YouTube channel Bookpilled, doing a review of R.A. Lafferty's 1968 novel, The Reefs of Earth. I don't really have time to do this right now, but I'm just too excited about it. I gotta make this happen. I also I can't really afford Patreon subscriptions and that kind of thing, but I just had to pay my $6 and jump on to Bookpilled's Patreon to see this video. And I had some trepidation, I have to admit. I was going to be a bit devastated if he bashed it. However, I really enjoy Matt's reviews and perspective and the way that Matt talks about things. Matt is the one who runs Bookpilled. And if he had bashed it, I'm sure it would have been fascinating to see that and would have been also something I could bounce off of. I think it would have almost been worse if he'd just been underwhelmed by it or something, which I don't know how you can be underwhelmed by a Lafferty novel, maybe. But to my great joy, he loved it. He loved it. I can't emphasize that enough. I'm sure that eventually he's going to do a little 5-minute review of it along with, 2 or 3 other novels like he does for his main YouTube channel, which I'll be very excited to see that as well. And, because Lafferty news is so scarce, I'll probably do some kind of response to that as well. But, it's a big deal for a big YouTube channel or any kind of social media thing to cover Lafferty at all. He gets so little coverage. And then to do so glowingly is exciting. And I've referenced Matt 1,000 million times on this channel with, his one little review of Past Master. I can't stop referencing it, partly because it's a big kind of turning point publicly, I think, for Lafferty from a few years ago. And as Matt tends to do, there's just a couple little gems of the way he interacts with stuff that just, I don't know, for whatever reason, for me, they just keep on giving. I can just keep kind of referencing that. And I think that's probably going to be the case with this review from the Reefs of Earth as well. So apologies ahead of time, Matt. I don't know if, he gets notifications or anything, but I'll probably be tagging him a fair bit from time to time to reference this. But he says some really interesting and really spicy things in there. So I'm just going to go over that really quick. But I think above all, the key note here is that his video is joyous. It is full of enthusiasm and energy. And that, to me, is kind of the essence of Lafferty and what reading Lafferty is all about. And so I was overjoyed that he was overjoyed, So I'm going to mention a few other Lafferty news bits as well at the end, but let's just jump into this. And whatever, this is what I do. I'm going to be quoting him extensively here. Maybe he'll make this video available publicly. Sometimes he does that with his Patreons, but I doubt it. So he says, this is how he opens his video. This book got me activated. This fired my pistons. This is one of my favorite books that I've read this year, maybe ever. Now he's going to go on to qualify this a bit and say, a lot of this has to do with the context in which he's reading it, in the particular moment that he's in with his reading of SF, determines to a large degree how much he's getting out of this. And that's totally fine. So, I imagine his view of this is going to modify a little bit over time. I would love to think it remains pretty up there for him. But regardless, this initial response is very meaningful. He even goes so far as to say, oh my God, that it's a top 15 contender. Now, if you followed his channel, I think he's done 2, maybe 3 at this point, I'm not sure. But early on, I think in his channel, or in the sort of explosion of his channel, he did a top 15 that I think kind of went viral and made his channel big. And it was certainly one of the very first things I saw from him. And it's a lovely piece. It's responsible for me, and I think for many, many others, going, wait a minute, I need to try more SF, and even for people like me who are longtime readers of SF and fans of it, who maybe have, taken the pedal off the gas a little bit and are only reading smatterings of SF here and there and keep meaning to get around to stuff. his top 15 jolted many of us into going, okay, I want to get more into this or back into it. And his reviews are pithy, funny, and for me, they're touching. They touch something profound in me, many of them, and just, made me feel ways about life and literature and, what literature can do and stuff. And he does so, I'm praising him a lot here, so forgive me for that, but he does so in a way that is really down to earth. It's smart, articulate, savvy, snappy, and interesting, but for everybody. Just for the average person, let's talk about this stuff. And his review of Reefs of Earth is much the same. Now, do I think Reefs of Earth will actually make it into his top 15? Honestly, no, I don't. I just can't imagine Lafferty being in something that big in a public way. And maybe I'm just trying to guard my own feelings and I don't want to deal with the disappointment of having hoped for that and see it not happen. But the very fact that he would say that, I think, is really special, and I think that will mean if he does do it, I think he's done sort of a honorable mentions or here's what didn't make it in type stuff. I feel like Reefs of Earth might make it into that if nothing else. But anyway, he couldn't emphasize enough what a breath of fresh air reading The Reefs of Earth was after he's been reading so much SF that was middling, underwhelming, maybe even good but not great. And he says that The Reefs of Earth was, quote, a health potion that has filled me all the way back up. And I just love to hear that about Lafferty. Matt says that The Reefs of Earth is one of the weirdest books I've ever read, one of the best books I've ever read, one of the most fun books I've ever read. And that, again, just key for Lafferty, weird and fun. And again, he re-emphasizes and sort of admits that he might not have had such a good time reading The Reefs of Earth had he not been slogging through so much stuff that didn't really grab him. And then he says, most notably, as he puts it, Big Mean Gene, Gene Wolfe. And if you've been following Matt, you'll have seen, he has mixed at best feelings about the Book of the New Sun, which for many of us was like zero surprise. And it's interesting because, he talks about how The Shadow of the Torturer made it into that first top 15 that I'm talking about that was so moving and so on, but subsequently has not made it in, and he's really cooled off on Gene Wolfe. But he wanted to do his due diligence and get all the way through that, and even read Earth of the New Sun. And now that I've subscribed for this month, I'm only subscribing for the month, so I'm watching as many videos as I can, as I have time for. But I've seen his individual reviews sort of in the moment of each of the 5 books, because like I said, he read Earth as well. And they're more saucy, more spicy in his takes. And by the time he put out his summary review for the main YouTube channel, he had found a way to make a pretty balanced statement. And, he's really impressed with any number of things going on in the Book of the New Sun, as you would be. But overall, it's just like, this is just not for me. And I should say, the reason I'm bringing up the Wolfe stuff with him is because he brings it up a whole bunch in this review. And I think hearing a little more about his previous thoughts on Book of the New Sun helps frame some of the comparisons he's making between Lafferty and Wolfe. And, I'll say, I guess I find myself these days, I would say, somewhere halfway between the Wolfe cult, if you like, the many podcasts that just do Gene Wolfe the way I'm just doing Lafferty. Another big YouTube channel, what is it, Media Death Cult? I hope I got that right. Moid, is that the guy who does it? Did like a over 2 hours, I think, video on Book of the New Sun, which I watched and kind of enjoyed. I'll probably save my thoughts on this whole Gene Wolfe thing for another time, because I'm actually going to do finally my own video on Gene Wolfe for my Patreon track called Forgotten Bookshelf, stuff I haven't read for a long time. But I was majorly obsessed with Wolfe, and I have some things to say about that. And then I will, of course, revisit him at some point and do a more updated consideration of his work. But whereas I was once obsessed, and he was one of my all-time favorite writers, I think, he's not quite up there as much for me. There's still some incredible things going on in Wolfe. And I don't blame anybody I don't think it's weird that people think he's like the greatest ever. That makes a lot of sense. But similar to Matt, I'm not sure how much that's really the case for me these days. However, a lot of the things that bother Matt don't really bother me. And a lot of the things that do bother Matt do bother me. But where Matt finds Wolfe's sort of elisions and that authorial craftiness, kind of sleight of hand, hiding things from you and withholding and so on, that drives his videos on Patreon about it are great to watch. It's really amusing. It just drives Matt up the wall. And I really get it. I can see why it hits him that way. It doesn't really hit me that way. It doesn't like annoy me. If anything, some of the stuff that Wolfe does like that actually just bores me. I'm not really all that interested in that kind of literary sleight of hand. Now, I do like some literary sleight of hand. If you watch, the most recent video I put up with the panel of us talking about Lafferty's story, Thieving Bear Planet, Lafferty pulls an awesome sleight of hand, or maybe a few of them in that story that blew my mind. So I'm not like against that kind of thing, but the way Wolfe does it doesn't interest me all that much. I'm not really all that interested in his puzzles and solving them, as so many people seem to be obsessed with. And the solves that I've seen that are clear are, I don't care. I don't think they're interesting overall. So that aspect of Wolfe just kind of slides past me, and I'm not that bothered, although there's some of it I'd like to look a little more into and see if I can get some more out of it. So rather than being annoyed, I'm just kind of like, meh, whatever. And he's doing so much more at the same time, both in terms of sentences and I guess philosophy that do wow me, that I love, that's all happening almost at the exact same time as the sort of puzzles and stuff, that's what I focus on and enjoy. That's what nourishes me in Wolfe. And it doesn't nourish Matt at all. I think he likes some of the writing pretty well, but particularly the chunky philosophical passages are of very little interest to Matt, in part just because he's not interested in theology and things like that, which is a lot of what Wolfe is doing in there, although I don't feel that it's exclusively that. And Matt acknowledges some of it's just more philosophical ideas about free will and different things. But for Matt, when Wolfe does that, it's just not earned. It's not like he hasn't brought him in a way that makes him want to contemplate that. And Matt reads some hardcore stuff, some philosophical SF, not least the likes of Stanislav Lem or whoever, Le Guin and so on. So Matt is super up for that, but the way Wolfe does it and the content of it is just of no interest to him, so that's fine. But it is of interest to me. So when he, even early on hits like a philosophical chunk about a coin and what symbols mean, I'm just like, I'm like drooling, So I do like that about Wolfe, unlike Matt. But so given that, right, given that that's how Bookpilled feels about Gene Wolfe, and Book of the New Sun in particular. That's why it's so cool to hear him say about Lafferty's The Reefs of Earth. This is what Matt says, that this is what Wolfe was trying to do, I think, he says. Which is a really interesting statement to say, I think this is what Gene Wolfe was trying to do. Something like Lafferty's The Reefs of Earth. That's fascinating. Now, what's so fun about this, too, is like this whole Wolfe-Lafferty thing has just been coming up, and I'm loving it because I had been saying it for a while on this channel, always just dropping that in, just because it's a natural reference for me. And I kept being struck so much the deeper I looked into Lafferty, the more I was like, I think all the stuff that people say about Wolfe, that's similar to what Lafferty's doing, but it's not really the way we think about Lafferty. Not least because of the humor aspect and kind of the so-called craziness and bizarreness. But I kept pointing to how Wolfe himself points to Lafferty and says, in a way, to summarize, I always feel like Wolfe is kind of saying, here's the real deal, Lafferty. And, everybody acknowledges that someone like Borges, for example, is an influence on Wolfe. And maybe other literary writers, whether that be Nabokov, I don't know how to say it, Nabokov or, Proust and all that. And of course, then they also acknowledge that like genre writers like Jack Vance, and I'm not really sure who else, but others are like a different stream that influences Wolfe. And to the degree that anybody even acknowledges that Lafferty would be an influence on Wolfe, I think they would think of him as a genre influence. I don't think that so much. I think Wolfe will have discovered him within genre, but I think he has a similar type of influence on Wolfe to someone like Borges. And I think Lafferty is a Borges type figure disguised as a 60s, 70s semi-new wave SF writer. So I had been saying that kind of stuff. And then when Virgil from Literally Books did his recent review of Past Master, which has been a big thing for putting me in touch with several other YouTube channels on how the panel came about. He had heard about Lafferty through Wolfe and was a big fan of Wolfe, and just that's the natural main comparison that he made in his review of Past Master, which was really great to see. I was just like, yes, okay, thank you, confirmation. There is a Wolfe-Lafferty connection here. Now, I will say one other place I'd seen that connection was Alzabo Soup, the podcast that focuses on Wolfe, one of several, all of which are good in my opinion. Alzabo Soup super surprised me by doing an episode, 2 episodes on Snuffles. So fun. I'll put a link to that. And now, as part of the news I'm going to mention at the end, they've done another episode on Lafferty. So fun. And they drew, obviously just a Wolfe podcast doing a Lafferty expresses some kind of connection there, but they draw those connections very specifically and very well, and in ways overlapping with things I'd said and also distinct from. So really cool stuff there. So it was already in the air besides me there as well. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying like I was the first to ever say that. That's been a thing for a while, and probably before I ever entered the discourse. But it's not something you hear a ton. And mostly just people mention, they're both Catholics, and Wolfe mentioned Lafferty, and that's about it. But I think we're starting to see, wait a minute, there could be proper influence going on here, and this is what Matt says here. But anyway, Virgil had suggested some influence stuff, more so than I had. I was just talking about how there's similarities there, but I haven't said a whole lot about like Lafferty influenced Wolfe, and here's how. But Virgil kind of started that conversation, I think, on YouTube anyway. And then in my response videos to Virgil and Chris from Liminal Spaces and so on, I've kind of been bringing that up more and more. And so now Matt is saying the same thing, and it's just so cool. It's like, okay, this is becoming an official point of view about Lafferty and Wolfe and how these things work. But what Matt says is about Reefs of Earth that this is one of the things that filtered through Wolfe's kidneys before Book of the New Sun came out. And of course, he points out this is 1968, and Book of the New Sun comes out in 1980 or whatever. And I've made a big deal of that. And now I'm going to have to admit, that's really all he says in terms of influence. But I think Matt having read a ton of science fiction at this point, and a ton of science fiction from this era, and now having done his due diligence reading significantly in Wolfe, is kind of making that claim. I think it's significant. And honestly, other people saying all this stuff is now convincing me. I just, like I said, hadn't thought much about it, and I'm like, wow, man, I think this is even an important point for future Gene Wolfe studies, that Lafferty is more than just sort of a little touchstone there, but it's a proper influence. But what Matt goes on to say is that this is the part of Wolfe that I like, distilled and purified, and I just love it, he says. So interesting claim. Is this Wolfe distilled and purified? Obviously this came before Wolfe, but you could still kind of see it that way. And I would love to hear what other people think who've read this novel, or just Lafferty in general, and Lafferty and Wolfe, and what are your thoughts there? Do you have a preference between the two? Do you see comparison points, possible influence? And in a sense, whether you think maybe Lafferty is doing Wolfe better than Wolfe does. And I'm not trying to hang everything on that, and that's not even a hill I necessarily want to die on. But I think it just has some real traction that can help elucidate both authors, actually. So that's what I'm most excited about, is the sort of critical and interpretive fecundity of these ideas about the Lafferty-influenced Wolfe. Lafferty does what Wolfe does, but maybe better, type of chat going on. I just think this is good for criticism. This is good for readership and just thinking and talking through these things. Now, Matt goes on to make a few other comparisons. They're very, very, very interesting. So he says, in particular, that like Reefs of Earth, he says, is not like Joanna Russ, or he says the Strugatsky brothers, where by the end of books by people like that, he says that it's this culminating statement. It's a book about something. And then he says of Reefs of Earth, this isn't really about something, but it's so stylistically good that I don't think I need it to be a profound read. The writing style itself is so alive, it's so unique, it has so much to it. And there's a sense in which I completely agree with that. Like, so much of Lafferty is about the style, the writing, the verve, and so on. And that's its juice, that's its meat, you know. And indeed, that is more how I thought of this novel in particular when I first read it many years ago. I was like, I don't really know what that was about, but it was awesome. And it's been one of my all-time favorite Laffertys ever since. And it's, on any given day, it's my favorite Lafferty. Today, I would probably say it's my favorite Lafferty. However, as I've read and reread it, I'm like, ooh, whoa, there's some kind of profound stuff going on here on a couple different kinds of levels. There's some social critique going on here. There's definitely some sort of mythopoeic, philosophical type stuff going on. But I think the thing that I've been struck by the most is there's some kind of poignant biographical, psychological type stuff going on in here about coming of age amidst troubling adult issues and so on, that in its way is a little bit rare in Lafferty, which makes this even more special as a Lafferty novel. But it would make sense that on a first read, you're not necessarily getting much of that and just going, I don't know, it was just such great writing, it gave me such pleasure. And I have loved doing this deep read of Past Master. It's just made my appreciation of that novel go up, and I'm looking forward to finishing out the chapter outline that I've been doing. But I have been chomping at the bit to move beyond Past Master. I was just kind of doing it because I feel like that's kind of the biggest novel by Lafferty. If I would have started right where I wanted to, it would have been with Reefs of Earth. And I've been trying to decide whether I was going to do Reefs of Earth or Space Shanty next. And now I just know I'm going to do Reefs of Earth for sure. But where I've talked about with Past Master that the writing itself is a little bit in and out for me. It has some of the best stuff I've seen from Lafferty. It has amazing word music, as you know, Judith Merrill had said in her review of Past Master, and was a statement she was making about Lafferty in general, that he magics me with word music. I love that. And you can very much see that's what's happened to Matt here, is he's been magicked by that word music. But I think people go to Lafferty expecting that, and then they get it in this really odd way, and they're like, wait, is this word music? Maybe especially in a novel like Past Master that, for me, kind of goes in and out of that. Whereas for me, it's bumpy, a lot of it. And Matt will eventually acknowledge an aspect of that. You know, it's not a perfect, smooth novel, but that word music, even when it's like a little out of control or whatever, is pretty solid, just note for note. It never stops in a book like this. So it was really nice to see Matt acknowledge that. Now, it's great because he points out, like, this book isn't really about plot. That's not really what I got out of it. And I agree with that, and that's really what I go to Lafferty for. I don't go for plot, I go for this word music and so many other things going on. And there are some cool plot things that happen in his novels, and very much so in this one. But that's not really what it's all about, and some of it like hangs together better than others, but that you don't really care, and that's what Matt said, I don't really care. But when he sums up a few little things about the plot, he says this, he says, it's almost like a Grapes of Wrath style itinerant family travels through the United States, winds up in a southern town called Lost Haven in Appalachia. And remember, he has already mentioned that this is a family of aliens. And I'm not really going to try to sum up the plot here either. But he kind of talks about that aspect in a nice little way as well. But that's the great thing in this review as well, is he makes a couple awesome connections to quote-unquote literary fiction, canonical American fiction, which is so important to me. I really think Lafferty fits at least as much in that tradition as science fiction. So a reference to Steinbeck is brilliant. And I have said in the past, not on this channel, I have to say, that I can recall, that Reefs of Earth in particular reads like Steinbeck meets, I don't know, Ray Bradbury and a little bit of like 60s psychedelic or something. And I've tried to reference other, I've also said it's like Twain meets Southern Gothic and different things like that. And I'll just make one tiny little quote-unquote correction here. When Matt says, you know, Appalachia is the location, that's also said on the back of this recent republication of The Reefs of Earth from Locust Press, from Locust Magazine. And it's a natural assumption to make. It, I suppose it maybe feels a bit like that. But more importantly, it's that the book itself actually clearly indicates that it's Oklahoma and that it's actually not far from Lafferty's Tulsa. But what Matt goes on to point out that I didn't know about the novel, for some reason I have never looked up this term bagger thatch. There's these bagger thatch verses that the puka can say to make things happen in the world. Mostly bad things happen to people that they want to get at. But Matt noted that it comes from an Irish Gaelic word, bagrach, if that's how you say it. It may be a little more like bagarach or bagra. But Matt points out that it means menace or malice. And I looked it up and it has a couple other valences as well that are relevant. Maybe we'll get into that another time. So that was fun to see and fits totally with how Lafferty's using it. And Matt made the aside that it kind of seems to connect or, has resonances with quote unquote magic systems or whatever in Jack Vance's Dying Earth, which I still haven't read. So that's an interesting connection. And that he notes generally there's a Vancian quality to this novel, but also, as he says, it's Faulknerian, which I was like, yes! Not that I have like massive ties to thinking about Lafferty in terms of Faulkner in particular, but he has come up in my mind with Lafferty in addition to the likes of Twain, which may seem a little unusual at first because their registers seem so different and the way they use language may seem quite different. In the same way that it may seem strange for me to often compare Lafferty to Cormac McCarthy. But I'm telling you, Lafferty's in there. That is a huge part of Lafferty's language and style and approach. When you think of authors like McCarthy and Faulkner and, moving into other authors like Toni Morrison and so on, Lafferty's in that family of authors. Willa Cather is another one that comes to mind for me. And I will say, actually, the writer Andy Duncan, whom I haven't read, but writes an afterword to R.A. Lafferty's 900 Grandmothers in the best of. And I don't love a lot of the intros and stuff to this. I think they just do like a summary of the plot and say a few faffy generalized things. But there's some really good ones in here as well. And this afterword in particular for 900 Grandmothers is one of the best things in there. It's almost like a little mini essay, and it draws comparisons to Faulkner and Southern literature generally and things like that. And I was like, yes, that's what I'm talking about. And Matt clocks that as well, as he says it has that Southern Gothic, dark, weird, creepy, bayou realism, which I think he's just playing around, but I love that. That's perfect. Maybe not the bayou per se, but that's the kind of thing that Lafferty's doing. And I, again, have been saying for some time that this is kind of Lafferty's take on Southern Gothic. Maybe like Flannery O'Connor meets what? I'm not sure. Almost like Flannery O'Connor meets Philip K. Dick or something along those lines. Just that sort of weirder edge of 60s, 70s SF, with a strong dose of things like Flannery O'Connor, for example. But as Matt goes on to note, it has elements of SF, fantasy, horror, high weirdness. Maybe it's weird fiction, technically, or slipstream. It's just other. It's all of the above and none of the above. And that's Lafferty. That is Lafferty, and I've been saying that for so long. He's like so many of these different things and then yet none of them. But it's so good to see somebody like Matt acknowledge that about his writing and about this book in particular. And high weirdness is a term that Matt comes back to frequently. Good term. He goes on to say the style reminds me quite a bit of Cordwainer Smith, in that Smith wrote with that weird flourish, but it felt really controlled. That's what he says about Smith. A weird flourish, but it's controlled. And then he says, and Lafferty feels even more on top of that writing style. Very cool. He says, superficially, it reads as sort of scattershot and improvised, but you can tell that there's just a level of focus and mastery and control in Lafferty that is, as Matt goes on to say, 10 out of 10, top shelf. About as good as genre writing gets. Very cool. And again, I know those panel videos we made are long, but I'm telling you, they're gold, man. That's juicy stuff in there. It's like entertaining, rich discussion, like for the whole hour or however long each video is. The last one's like nearing 2 hours, but I'm telling you, it's worth it. But we talked a whole lot about like, man, this stuff is so seemingly wild, almost chaotic, but it is very tight, very thought through. Not that Lafferty doesn't allow some of that like rambunctious, like, whoa, this is unwieldy here and there. He certainly does, but there's also a control or a mastery going on there as well. And it's really nice. Again, see Matt acknowledge that. And he stops in the middle of this comparison to Smith to say, it's hard to put into words exactly what it reads like. And that is so true of Lafferty. It's like, you know there's something going on here literarily, but as soon as you try to say what it is, like when you go to great authors, whether that's, genre authors, I don't know, whoever, Le Guin, or indeed like Gene Wolfe, or non-genre authors like the Faulkners and whoever, the Joyces, whatever, you kind of know how to say, this is great literature. You can point to the specifics of their sentences and languages and stuff. But when you try to point at Lafferty, you're like, it's trickier. And that's something, this channel, for example, is just constantly wrestling with. And I hope, as I've gone, like, say, in the deep dives with Past Master, kind of really quoting out some chunks and then kind of trying to dig in there a little bit and talk about what they're doing, I hope it's becoming more evident. Though I think it's going to become still much more evident through discussing books like this one. And indeed, I will point again to those panels. I think you see some of it come out there pretty strongly as well. But Matt goes on that he says it does read like Cordwainer Smith, but it's more organic. And I've read a good sampling of Cordwainer Smith's stories, and I like them a lot, and I think I'm going to like them more as I get more familiar with a lot of his stuff. But I've always noted that where there is definitely a similarity of lyricism and weirdness in Smith is not as great of a craftsman, and indeed I would say is much more hit and miss off and on than Lafferty. And Matt goes on to say that Lafferty will make jokes in the prose, or he'll use wordplay, or he'll have some absurdity in the way something's phrased. And from that, listen to what he says. And then Lafferty will play off that so that it forms this weird sort of crystalline, half chaotic structure. So true. And that's why it's difficult to say what's going on here. You're like, it's happening, but you kind of got to see it build up and pile up and become both crystalline and chaotic at the same time. It's an achievement. And for those of us who like weird stuff, and indeed I would say sort of punk-edged stuff that's nevertheless really touching into quote-unquote high art or whatever, it's just gold. It's not something you see all the time. And Matt goes on to say, it feels like familiar tropes. It feels like a Ray Bradbury story, like something you've read before, but it's so much darker than Bradbury, and it's so much less predictable. He goes on to say there's a lot of pretty surprising violence. And again, he emphasizes, man, I'm tripping over my own words trying to express how much I like the book and in what way I like the book. And that's, again, it's just like, that's what we all do with Lafferty, but it's there. It's in the reading. It doesn't grab everybody, the first time, whatever it may be. And again, that I've talked a whole bunch about expectations and things that he's going to fulfill what we claim about him, but in ways you don't expect. And there may be some adjustment that needs to happen. And Matt he says, it's just one of those books, that he has a special place in his brain for it. And then he says this really cool statement. It fits into the canon of other works so well as this superintending, sort of floating, free radical thing that has points of reference to everything else, but it's different. I love that sense of a superintending. I had to look up free radical, several sort of physicsy type terms going on here that I do think speak to what Lafferty's doing. We'll have to dig into that some other time. But because it's so literary, but so playing the game of SF at that time as well, it does have this like superposition type quality in its relation to the genre. Now let's get into what Matt says about Wolfe versus Lafferty. He starts with the salvo. It does the thing that Gene Wolfe does, but it does it better. He digs into this a little bit in a really cool way. He says part of the story in Lafferty is that it's playing on these old colonial horrors, these old leftover ghosts of American history, sometimes quite literally. And he says in this regard that it actually feels a lot like Pedro Páramo by Juan Rulfo. That was not a reference I was familiar with. Then later I saw him do a review of just that book, but I didn't remember that was the name of the book he referenced in this review of The Reefs of Earth. And I was like, ooh, I want to read that book. And through his review, I remembered that Juan from the YouTube channel Plagued by Visions, which is excellent as well, had recommended it. So I'm going to get a hold of that. But then as I watched his review of Reefs of Earth the second time, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that's interesting that I was drawn to that book. And then he's saying there's resonances there, which is, I think, going to be a recurring thing with Lafferty. Because as I pointed out back in episode 20, Judith Merrill compared Past Master to Miguel Asturias' novel Mulata de Tal. I'm probably not saying that right. But another connection to sort of Central American, South American authors and Lafferty's work, which is not entirely surprising given that Lafferty is kind of a Southwestern writer and often features, Mexican characters and a bit of Spanish here and there. Again, similar connections to Cormac McCarthy and stuff. So I'll be interested to chase up Matt's reference to Pedro Paramo there. And so Matt notes that there's a prominence of Native Americans in this novel and a connection between the Puka, who are the aliens of this novel, and the Native Americans, and that it's just dealing with American history and American Indian history in particular. And because of those things, Matt says, there's a feeling of archaeology in it. There's a feeling of reference to a mythology that's just sort of alluded to and informs all the action and is imminent in what's happening contemporaneously, and that it's this looming presence in much the same way as ancient history gives Book of the New Sun that sense of depth. And indeed, there's like a particular moment, a particular chapter in here that like has a strong, awesome image of sort of archaeology and geology related to a Native American burial mound, and the kids kind of hiding in there with like living ancestors of Native Americans. One of my favorite parts of the novel, and Matt's tracking on all that. And indeed, I had not thought of that as like a connection to similar things going on in the Book of the New Sun, and I do see that. That's interesting. And Matt goes on to note that, like Wolfe, Lafferty uses archaisms and language and wordplay, but he says in distinction from Wolfe, it's not like pleased with itself. It's just sort of fun. And, I don't know that I agree that Wolfe is all pleased with himself and all that kind of stuff. But I understand how it hits Matt that way and some other readers as well. And I love that it doesn't hit him that way with Lafferty. Maybe some people feel that way about Lafferty. I even saw one comment on Matt's video that suggested maybe that reader did feel that way with Lafferty, which is kind of a surprise to me. I don't know that I've really heard that about Lafferty. But generally speaking, I feel like Lafferty, and I talked about this in episode 23 and or 24 in my responses to these other channels covering Lafferty, that there is this like generosity and inviting in Lafferty that makes you feel in on it rather than like, ooh, can you figure this out? Even though there's still some, you can do that and play that way and have fun with it and go, oh man, there's things to research here. But as Matt notes, in this fun way. And as I noted in those videos, I'm not saying there's no fun in Wolfe and that he's not doing that too, but it does come across more overtly in Lafferty. As Matt goes on to elucidate here in a really interesting way, he says, I think that Lafferty holds a lot back in the way that Wolfe holds a lot back, and he uses a lot of allusion. Actually, as Matt notes, he uses a lot of Christian allegory in the way that Wolfe does, because Lafferty also was a very devout Catholic. But it's not standoffish. That's Matt's words. He goes on, he's not the dark lord behind the scenes. It's more playful. The difference is, reading this, it's like Lafferty is playing with you. And when I read Book of the New Sun, I feel like Wolfe is toying with you. Super interesting distinction. And I'm butchering Matt's delivery. He's really funny talking about all this stuff. So forgive me that. I'm trying to get into the meat of what he's saying, because like Lafferty, Matt can hide a lot of pretty rich criticism behind a bunch of comedic delivery. But I love that distinction. And again, in those two response videos is exactly what I talked about and have talked about elsewhere. I think I talked about it in my Snuffles videos and so on, that there is I wouldn't have put it quite this way, but I like Matt's putting it this way, that Lafferty is playing with you and Wolfe is toying with you. Whether you think of it exactly that way or not, there's definitely a distinction there. And then Lafferty is inviting you in to play, and it's fun and it's jokey, with all that rich literary depth, though, that Wolfe has. Whereas Wolfe feels a little more like, I don't know, a wizard master to his apprentice or something, saying, can you solve this? Which I'm sure for a lot of people, that's perfect. That's what they want. but not for everybody, obviously. But importantly, Matt goes on to note, this book is also really pretty. It's a really beautiful book, he says. He says it's sort of solemn and morally ambiguous and dark, but also the language is just so rich. It's also extremely clever, he notes. He talks about the chapter titles. I don't know if he's referencing how they add up to a poem or exactly what going on there, but that really kind of blew him away. And that he had this kind of aha moment and felt he'd never seen anybody do that in a book before. But I just love that emphasis on like, this is good literature. This is like nice to read. This is like the stuff you want. If you like words and sentences and literary qualities, you're going to get that out of this really weird, raucous, rambunctious aliens on the earth, just one little alien family in a Southern Gothic sort of mode, type of book. And Matt talks about how usually he's like always annoyed by poetry in a novel. And this has a ton in it through those Baggerthatch verses. But it didn't annoy him at all in this. And he says even in one moment where he starts threading the Baggerthatch verses, like every paragraph, into the prose, that it's great what he says. He says it was like strains of music in a movie, and it was just so affecting. And it is a good portion. And sometimes actually people complain about Lafferty's verses scattered throughout many of his stories and books because they are intentionally doggerel verses that don't entirely work rhythmically, and they're often very silly, and the rhymes are these hilarious on-purpose stretches and stuff. And they've always hit me really well, and I think they must have hit Matt that same way, where it just takes all the pomposity and pretentiousness out of poetry. I love poetry, so I don't necessarily think that poetry is naturally pretentious or something, but it can come across that way. And maybe even especially when a novelist does it. But Lafferty is just playing and having fun and kind of gets past your defenses, puts you off guard, and just goes, okay, yeah, we're having fun here. And there's actually some nice poetry in that silliness as well. But that was really cool to see that Matt thought it really added something to the reading experience. And again, he emphasizes that he was only dimly aware of the plot, that it wasn't really about that. He says, I just had this pleasant hum in my brain of reading the prose, of just watching Lafferty at work or at play, so that the actual plot, the actual contents of the book were of secondary importance, as he says. And he says, I just had such a great time reading it. And that's exactly it. It's exactly it. It's what I've been saying for so long, especially in the novels that people often find so difficult to sort of follow or whatever. And it's like, it's not about that, which is really how I read Wolfe as well. I don't really care about these big plot things so much. I'm just like sentence by sentence, like this is a joy. But for me, much, much more so in Lafferty. But that's what it's like. I guess, it either hits you that way or it doesn't. But for some of us, it's just like, I just like watching this guy work and play. And I think once you get into that mode and enjoy Lafferty that way, there's enough plot there to also add to that novelistic experience that you're kind of hoping for when you read a novel. But you kind of have to let it recede to secondary importance, like Matt says. And despite earlier saying that the sheer style itself is 10 out of 10, top shelf, he wouldn't call the book itself 10 out of 10, he says. It's not perfect. And he notes, that the plot, as he puts it, bellies, and it's not always clippy, as he puts it. And this is what I've talked about with Past Master, which I think has more of that kind of trouble than the Reefs of Earth. The Reefs of Earth is very choppy like that. Lafferty said all his novels were choppy, and I agree with him, but I just think some much more so than others, or in ways that work better or worse. And in this one, it's kind of a rough ride, but a fun one that just never lets up for me. And Matt will say this too, such that it's a page turner and you can get through it no problem. Matt says that I'm not sure the plot even really makes sense, and I don't really care. And I think that's true, and maybe it does or doesn't. Probably more so than we realize, and these sorts of things. But regardless, it's like, that's not exactly the point here. As he notes, he says, I've read technically better constructed novels, but as a chunk of writing, this, way more than Past Master, has put Lafferty right at the top of my list, he says. Maybe not favorite ever, but top 5. What? Oh, I'm guarding my heart. I don't think that's going to last, but that it would even be there for a moment, I think is cool. He just keeps going, it's such a cool book, man. It's such a cool book. He says, what a pleasure, peak genre reading experience. Because as he notes, for him, he has a different cover I don't actually like as much as this one, and I don't think either of them are like the best of those kinds of old covers, but he really likes it. But he says it's just that kind of thing where you're looking at these old covers and they're so cool, and then contents never really match what you're after, and in this case, it totally matched, and he was like, it was mind-blowingly weird and good. And again, he notes that a lot of this is his pleasure in reading it is heightened, he says, by a sense of relief of having had these frustrations with Gene Wolfe and to have that pressure released. And then he says, and now it's nice to have something to point to and say, this is what I mean, this is my preference. He says, this is what I wanted Book of the New Sun to be, even though aesthetically, they're barely related. He says, there's some resemblance, but he says in terms of the mechanic of how it's written, there's just something about it that's so Wolfian. And this, again, is what Virgil had said from literally books. So yeah, maybe not, this huge aesthetic comparison, though there's some with something like Book of the New Sun, but maybe at that level of literary architectonics or something, there's a strong resemblance. And for Matt, it's like, this is the way to do it. And he notes that like now he's really been bitten by the bug, and he's like, I gotta collect Lafferty. I really want to get as much as I can find, especially given how rare and out of print it is. So he says he's going to be prioritizing him and prioritizing reading whatever he has of him. And he says, man, I needed a book like this, a book that when you read it, it's like, right, this is the juice that I squeeze for. This is the thing that I like about genre fiction. And he says this interesting thing. He kind of cuts off his thought, but I know what he's getting at here. He says, this sense of wonder. Not someone speculating, what if there was a spaceship that could fly backwards at the speed? And then he cuts himself off. He's like, not that sense of wonder. And then what he does go on to say is maybe not what he doesn't get onto a positive, what is the sense of wonder in Lafferty. He just talks more about like the phenomenon of Lafferty. He says, the sense of wonder that I can't believe there's just some guy living in Oklahoma in the 60s who wrote this thing that is totally forgotten. And he goes on to say, this is so much better than Heinlein, Clark, Asimov, Bradbury. And he really likes Bradbury, or The Martian Chronicles. And he says, look, I'm sure this book has its flaws, but he says, I just have this halo effect about reading it, which is cool. He just had such an enjoyable time reading it. He says he tore through it just cover to cover. There was never a dull moment. That's what I was saying. Unlike Past Master, I think this one is just cover to cover. And he says, Lafferty is like 2 more books like this away from being on my Mount Rushmore. Oh, don't get my hopes up, Matt. That's not fair. Because I've been thinking about this and now I'm all tortured by it. I'm like, oh no, I don't know if there's any books left by Lafferty that will hit Matt quite this way. Because if he were to go on to say Fourth Mansions, which is from this era and readily available, I feel like he's going to have some of the reaction he had toward Wolfe. He might find him a little too much like Wolfe in the ways that he doesn't like. I think he would enjoy it more and he'd get a lot out of it. But I, as a huge Lafferty fan, only made it like 2/3 or maybe 3/4 of the way through that novel the first time I read it. This was many years ago. But I did hear people talk about it so consistently amongst Lafferty fans that it was like the best or one of the best that I finally went back to it. And I do think it's one of the best. And it's the prose above all that carries me through that book. And it's a contender for Lafferty's very best long-form work of just sheer prose. And some of the imagery and the ideas in there are just awesome. But like Past Master, I guess, it has these kind of qualities that just budge it up a little bit for me. But not for others. Others are just like, this is perfect through and through. Not sure it would hit Matt that way. And again, it's more overtly theological like Past Master. And that was one of the things that Matt really enjoyed. I should say, he says it's worth noting that the sort of heavy-handed anti-utopianism of Past Master is totally absent in this. And he says that the religious elements of it are there, but very understated. And he says it's not that stuff stops him from liking Past Master or whatever, but he says this is more of a neutral book. And Fourth Mansions is as theological as Past Master, although I will say it's much weirder, way weirder in every aspect, including the theology. So that might make it a little more readable for Matt and readers like Matt. But again, like maybe Space Shanty, I think because Matt has said with some other authors like Bob Shaw and others that he really enjoys like a clippy space opera type thing rather than these big bloated space operas. And, you know, Space Shanty is Lafferty's take on space opera in a way. It's kind of, as I've said before, it's kind of a space western retelling of Homer's Odyssey. Like, it's explicitly modeled on Homer's Odyssey. It's very silly, more silly than this, but it's still really rich in language and everything else. But way, way more cartoonish and comic strippy in a great way, I think. So I'm not sure, but I think Matt would enjoy it. I just don't know if he'd be like, you know, if it would put Lafferty on his Rushmore, so to speak. And I definitely don't think Arrive at Easter Wine from 1971 would work for Matt at all. That is just a dense, naughty, little bit of a failure of a novel in a great way to me. It's like one of my favorites all the time, and the more I read it, the more I'm just like, oh my God, this is truly genius. But it's gnarly and super theological, again, in even weirder ways. Like he gets more overtly theological and more weird with it as he goes on in a lot of ways. Lafferty does. But I don't think that's the right book for Matt. I will say, here's the other one I think Matt might really enjoy in a very different register in a lot of ways than something like Reefs of Earth. And that is The Devil is Dead. That's the novel I want to see Matt read. I shouldn't hope too much, but I have hopes he might like it because of these books, like what it sounds like anyway, his coverage of Pedro Páramo and some other literary fiction that he likes that has elements of magical realism and has elements of kind of a haunting beauty. But Lafferty still definitely has his playfulness and humor in The Devil is Dead, but not nearly as much as some of the other ones, or at least it's in different ways, and it has, you know, as I've said, sort of dreamlike qualities and different things. Not very plotty, but I don't think that bothers Matt. Just a whole different thing. And if anything, hopefully he'll be like, oh, I didn't know Lafferty could do this as well. So that's that, and maybe Space Shanty are the ones that I'm hoping he'll check out. And I'm honestly not sure there's much else. Maybe if he wants to go all out, super acid trip, planetary novel, he could try Annals of Klepsis. Might be too much. And it is, yeah. But it's one of my favorites. So I don't know, maybe some of those novels will kind of work for Matt. Maybe he'll find a short story collection or two, or just some short stories that really, really grab him, and maybe those all patched together might put Lafferty on the Rushmore. I kind of doubt it, but even that he's a contender there, I hope will remain for Matt. And, you know, it doesn't really matter. You know, it's just that when you like somebody's opinion and the way they talk about things, when they like something you really like, it's like, yes, thank you, this is significant. And that's why I'm invested in you know, talking about Matt, talking about this, you know. But he concludes by just saying, man, thumbs up, I'm so stoked, I'm excited, the juices are flowing, Reefs of Earth, 2 thumbs up. So lastly, a couple bits of news, this will just take a sec. Alzabo Soup covered Lafferty's story, Camels and Dromedaries, Clem, which I talked about a bit in episode 20 because I wrote an academic essay that was about that story and a couple others that involved doppelgangers. And again, as is typical with Alzabo Soup, when they cover the same thing I covered as with Snuffles, there's a little bit of overlap, though less so in this case. And then they just do different things with it that are really great. It's a good discussion. It's only for a portion of the episode because they also talk about Gene Wolfe's story, When the Whip Came Back, which is not a story I really care about, and them talking about it didn't make me want to go back to it. But it's a good complement to the way I talked about it. They don't really talk about the things that I talked about, and I don't really talk much. I talk a little bit about what they talk about, but they went good directions with it. The other bit of news is one of many reasons, I've had a lot going on, but one of many reasons I've been delayed in getting stuff out here is that I did manage to finally get together with Andrew Ferguson, Lafferty's biographer, to me, the premier scholar of Lafferty. We had a Zoom call. It was a little over 2 hours, I think, and I need to edit that. I don't know if I'm going to try to turn it into 2 one-hour videos, if I can find a way to split it, a point to split it at. But it was a rich conversation, and we're kind of calling it episode 0 because we just freewheeled it, you know, and just talked generally about Lafferty. And then I think when we have further Zoom calls, we'll try to get into, if we can, I think, a chapter by chapter, more of a deep dive on Past Master, which frees me up once I get done with this outline of the remaining chapters, sort of the second half of Past Master, to just move on to the Reefs of Earth even sooner. And lastly, I would just say, look, I don't know if you've seen that I put up these, like, what is it, about 4 videos of talking to vintage SF, literally books, and liminal spaces in this panel talking about 6 Lafferty short stories, all planetary tales. Very good ones, very fun, very exciting stories. A lot of horror in there, some anti-colonialism, and oh man, I can't emphasize enough. I know they're longer videos, but they're worth it. Think of them like podcast episodes. Their length is not weird if you think of a podcast episode. And I would recommend putting them in your ears. I think it kind of works that way. You don't necessarily need to see us talking about, although I do drop in a lot of visuals to keep things interesting in that way. But it's honestly a wall-to-wall, episode by episode, every minute of the hour, rich discussion between the 4 of us, and they're bringing out all these interesting insights about these stories. And I mean, there's a real through line to those videos as well, about like, what are aliens, what is space exploration. And we ended up in this place where we're like, man, this is a lot like Stanislav Lem, not least Solaris. And one commenter, in fact, let me read this comment. Here's a testimonial. Someone with the handle of Frabousie, Frabousie, don't know if that's a reference to something, who has commented a fair bit. Really, a person that interacts really nicely with the channel. It's really cool. Says this on our last video that we made, and I believe he has been watching each of these videos and commented on them, these panel videos. He says, "Discourse of this quality is such a rarity. These stories were so intellectually nourishing on their own, it felt almost gluttonous to hear them analyzed so expertly by everyone. This last video was particularly excellent. I'm glad that I wasn't the only one to draw ties to Solaris, actually to Soviet Golden Age sci-fi in general. Whereas Western sci-fi from the 40s to the 60s depicted shiny and optimistic futures, the Soviets were fixated on the limits to man's understanding in a limitless universe. Lafferty seems to have that fixation as well, though instead of darkening his outlook, stroke his writing, it seems to be the source of his enthusiasm. Thank you, everyone." So there you have it, a rare quality of discourse with expert analysis. No, I really appreciate it. And it's awesome to hear him confirm that connection we were feeling to like Solaris and that kind of thing. You know, and I guess your mileage may vary, and I'm not guaranteeing everybody will love every second of these videos, but I kind of agree with him. Generally speaking, I think, you know, it's fascinating. And I will say, I don't think you have to have read all these stories to get something out of it. And we talk a bit in the very first one about like, is this spoilery or not? And can you spoil Lafferty? So there's an interesting discussion there, but we decided ultimately like, you could probably just not know these stories, watch them. And yes, a few things, important things will be spoiled for you, but you'll still find it fascinating to go read those stories. And watching us talk about them might be the thing that makes you, you know, actually have the motivation to go read them, to go find them and read them. So that's my little plug for our panels. We put a lot of time into it, but that's okay. You don't have to watch it. You know, it's whatever. It's there. Hopefully it will find its audience. But I did at least want to mention it. You know, I'm proud of those. They're really good. Unfortunately, my sound quality in them is terrible, but it's understandable, but it just sounds bad and kind of looks bad. I'll see if I can improve that in the future with Zoom call stuff, but it doesn't really matter. It's more about that whole discussion. And if this is of interest to you, as I tease in the little thumbnail for the last video, that we talk about Thieving Bear Planet by Lafferty, and that is one of Jeff Vandermeer's very favorite Lafferty stories that he talked about quite a bit some years ago, and then also wrote the introduction to in The Best of Lafferty, which I quote from a fair bit toward the end of our discussion, and we talk about what he says about it. And that would be another point of comparison. Like Lem, I think there's a Vandermeerian quality. I think that though Vandermeer only discovered Lafferty around the time that he and his wife were making the big book of SF, and they included 900 grandmothers in that, I think Lafferty became a huge influence on Vandermeer and is why you see some of what Vandermeer goes on to do after Area X. I'm not saying solely or anything, and I could even be just 100% wrong, but I don't think so. Especially, listen to our discussion of Snuffles and Thieving Bear and the Laffertius Ursus, as I call it, the Lafferty and bears, and what Vandermeer does with bears, which he was already doing, but I think, you know, as he goes on with them, I think there's some Lafferty influence there. Whatever, it doesn't matter. But I think there's resonances between, if you're interested in Vandermeer or the type of stuff Vandermeer's doing, or Lem and these sorts of things. I really think, as much as I've said Lafferty fits in with this whole Faulkner and whoever, you know, he also fits in with these strains within science fiction or speculative fiction or weird fiction, which again, I just love that Matt clocked that and was like, this is weird fiction. Which again, I've said for quite some time. All right, like I said, I'm really busy. I wish I could do a whole October thing like people do with Halloween and do scary stories from Lafferty and maybe from others, but I just don't have time for it this year. I'm thinking of doing like a spooky in November thing to like, you know, keep that strain going, because why should we stop enjoying all that once Halloween has happened? But yeah, it's probably going to be a minute even before I can get the videos up with Andrew and then go on with Past Master. But I will get back to it. I just have academic deadlines and other things, but I'm looking forward to it. Hope you're looking forward to it too. Let me know what you think about this Reefs of Earth and Bookpilled covering it and whatever else. Keep the conversation going, and we'll talk more soon. Thanks for watching.